The dust of Redemption, Arizona tasted of regret. It settled on every surface, a fine red powder that coated the brims of hats, crept into the lines on men's faces, and muted the world to a uniform shade of weariness. For Cassidy Flynn, it was the color of his soul. A year had passed since he'd bought this patch of forgotten land, a year of trying to outrun the ghosts that galloped at his heels. He stood before the general store, a list of supplies clutched in a hand that still remembered the weight of a cavalry saber. He was a ghost himself, a tall, gaunt figure whose shoulders stooped not from age, but from the invisible burden he carried. The day shattered with the explosion of glass from the Redemption Bank and Trust across the street. Men in long dusters poured out, their faces obscured by bandanas. It was a robbery, brutal and efficient. Townsfolk scattered like quail, diving for the cover of horse troughs and alleyways. Cassidy's body went rigid. His eyes, once sharp enough to track a hawk across the sky, now saw only the chaos of another time, another place. The scent of gunpowder, sharp and acrid, was the same. The screams were the same. His training, buried under 3 years of self-imposed exile, stirred like a half-dead thing. He automatically scanned for cover, noted the robbers' positions, gauged the angle of the sun. His hand twitched, reaching for a weapon that was no longer on his hip. He was a civilian now, a hermit, a man who had earned his solitude. The leader of the gang stepped out last, a man who moved with an unnerving calm amidst the pandemonium. He wasn't just a brute. There was a theatrical grace to his violence. While his men stuffed canvas bags with money, he walked back into the bank and emerged moments later holding not a bag of cash, but a single small object that glinted in the harsh sunlight, a silver locket. From across the street, Cassidy saw it clearly. An oval of polished silver, intricately carved with the image of a swooping falcon, its wings outstretched. At its center, a cluster of turquoise stones, arranged like a constellation he knew by heart. His breath caught in his throat, a ragged, painful sound. It couldn't be. It was Sarah's locket. The world around him dissolved into a memory so vivid, it burned. Fort Defiance. The air thick with the smell of pine smoke and impending betrayal. Sarah, her face alight with a gentle smile, holding that exacted locket in her palm. A gift, she'd said, from that young soldier Thomas. He asked me to keep it safe for him. Isn't it beautiful? The memory fractured, replaced by the crack of rifles, the screams, the sight of her falling, amidst the panicked stampede. He had reached for her, but his duty, his orders, his fatal hesitation had pulled him away for a critical second. When he looked back, she was gone, swallowed by the horror he had failed to prevent. The locket had vanished with her. And now, here it was in the hand of a bank robber in a town called Redemption. The leader, Gideon Nash, held the locket up to the light, admiring it, as if it were the only thing of value in the entire town. His eyes, cold and intelligent above his bandana, swept the street and settled for a fleeting moment on Cassidy. It felt like a physical touch, a chilling recognition that made no sense. Cassidy's muscles coiled. He could act. His rifle was in the scabbard on his horse 50 feet away. He could make a stand, try to stop them, try to reclaim that piece of his shattered past. But the familiar paralysis seized him. The ghost of Fort Defiance rose before him, whispering of failure. Hesitation was his curse. It had cost him his career, his honor, and the only person he had ever loved. What if he acted and failed again? What if more innocents paid the price for his intervention? While he stood frozen, caught between the man he was and the man he used to be, the robbers mounted their horses. Gideon Nash tucked the silver locket into his vest pocket, gave a mock salute to the terrified town, and spurred his horse into a gallop. They thundered out of Redemption, leaving behind a cloud of red dust and the suffocating silence of Cassidy's own cowardice. The town sheriff, Elias Thorne, a man whose face was a roadmap of cynical disappointments, ambled over to him. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Cassidy's boot. "Saw you standing there," Flynn Thorne said, his voice dry as a bone. "Looked like you were about to do something heroic for a second. Then you didn't." Cassidy said nothing, his gaze fixed on the empty road where the dust was slowly settling. "Figured as much," the sheriff muttered, turning away. "Some men are just built to watch." The words were a brand on his already scarred conscience. He had failed. Again. He turned without buying his supplies and rode back to his ridge, the solitude he had once sought now feeling like a prison of his own making. He didn't know who Gideon Nash was or why he had stolen that locket. But he knew one thing with a soul-crushing certainty: his past was not finished with him yet. 1 year later, the memory of the robbery had faded into the tapestry of his nightmares, another thread of failure woven into the whole. The ridge was his sanctuary and his penance. He patrolled his fence line not to keep things out, but to keep himself in. It was on one such morning, with the dawn air crisp and smelling of sage, that he found her. She was crumpled beside the creek that marked his property line, a broken bird cast from the sky. Blood soaked the torn fabric of her dress, a deep crimson against the dark, intricate weave. Her breathing was a shallow, desperate flutter. For a long, damning moment, he considered walking away. 3 years of isolation had taught him a single bitter lesson: involvement was a synonym for trouble. But something about the way the morning light caught the curve of her cheekbone, the proud set of her jaw, even in unconsciousness, stopped him cold. She couldn't have been more than 20, with delicate features that spoke of a strength that was currently eclipsed by injury. Rope burns, still fresh and angry red, chafed her wrists. He knelt, his movements stiff, and his eyes were drawn to the necklace at her throat. It was not Sarah's locket, but it was a piece of similar Apache craftsmanship, silver and turquoise, expertly worked. It felt like a sign, a cruel echo from a past he could not escape. With a sigh that seemed to pull up from the soles of his boots, Cassidy scooped her up. She was surprisingly light, her skin radiating a feverish heat. A nasty gash across her forehead needed immediate attention. As he carried her toward the stark silhouette of his cabin, he noted the quality of her clothing. This was not the rough-spun fabric of a settler's daughter. The weaving was beautiful, a language of patterns and colors that spoke of heritage and pride. Inside his sparse home, he laid her gently on his cot. The motions of tending to her wounds were automatic, a muscle memory from a life he'd left behind. He cleaned the gash with the methodical efficiency of a man who had stitched up battlefield injuries under fire. The head wound was ugly, but not fatal. The rope burns told a story of capture and escape. As he worked, she stirred. Dark eyes, deep and intelligent, fluttered open. They held the weary caution of a trapped animal, but there was no panic in them. Instead of screaming or scrambling away, she studied his face, her gaze so intense it felt as if she were reading the darkest chapters of his history. When she finally spoke, her voice was a dry whisper, and the words were not in English nor in Apache. "¿Por qué me ayudas? Why are you helping me?" The question, delivered in perfect Spanish, struck him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just the language that was unexpected. It was the tone. Not fear, not gratitude, but a kind of exhausted resignation, and the sound of a person who had been betrayed too many times to expect kindness. "Because you needed help," he answered, his own voice rusty from disuse. He repeated it in the halting Spanish he'd picked up along the border. "¿Por qué necesitabas ayuda?" She closed her eyes, a flicker of pain crossing her features. For a moment, he thought she'd lost consciousness again. Then she spoke, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "They will come looking for me." "Who will?" Before she could answer, the rhythmic beat of approaching horses cut through the morning stillness. Cassidy moved to the window, his body instantly alert. He peered through the gaps in the wooden shutters. 3 riders were making their way up his dirt path, their movements economical and precise. They wore the dusty clothes of drifters, but they sat their horses like soldiers, their eyes methodically scanning his property, evaluating every shadow, every potential point of defense. Behind him, the girl's breathing had gone silent. When he glanced back, her eyes were wide with a terror that hadn't been there before. "Too late," she whispered. The lead rider dismounted with a fluid ease, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth without a sound. Cassidy's blood ran cold. It was him, Gideon Nash, the man from the bank in Redemption, the man with Sarah's locket. Nash approached the cabin, his companions remaining mounted, their hands resting casually near their sidearms. It was a practiced, intimidating posture. "Morning," Nash called out, his voice carrying the same false, honeyed friendliness Cassidy remembered. It was the cordial tone of a rattlesnake just before it strikes. "Name's Gideon Nash. We're looking for something that belongs to us." Cassidy stepped onto his porch, his Winchester rifle held loosely in his hand, visible but not threatening. He had to play this carefully. He had no idea how this girl was connected to Nash, but his gut screamed that it was dangerous. "Don't see how I can help you," Cassidy said, his voice flat. "Nothing here but me and my land." Nash's smile never wavered, but his eyes were sharp, cataloging every detail of Cassidy's property. The freshly disturbed earth near the creek, the single set of tracks leading to the cabin that weren't Cassidy's. "See, that's funny. Because we've been tracking our property for 2 days now. And the trail leads right to your door." Property. The word hung in the air, ugly and dehumanizing. Cassidy's grip on the rifle tightened imperceptibly. "I don't know what kind of property you're tracking." "A young Apache girl," Nash said, his tone conversational. He took a step closer, his hand now resting openly on the butt of his pistol. "Goes by the name Ayanna. Real valuable to certain parties, if you catch my meaning. She's been causing some folks a considerable amount of trouble." Inside the cabin, Cassidy heard a faint rustle of movement. Ayanna. She was trying to find a way out, just as he would in her position. The rope burns on her wrists suddenly made perfect, sickening sense. These men weren't drifters. They were kidnappers. "Haven't seen any Apache girls," Cassidy lied, his voice a low gravel. "You boys might want to try the next valley over." Nash chuckled, a dry, mirthless sound. "That's disappointing to hear. Because see, we know she's hurt. And hurt animals. Well, they tend to seek shelter. A man living alone out here, a man with a certain history, might just take pity on something that wandered onto his land." He knew him. Nash knew who he was. One of the mounted men shifted in his saddle, and Cassidy caught the glint of sunlight on a second pistol tucked into his belt. These men were armed for a war, not a simple tracking job. Like I said, Cassidy repeated his stance, widening slightly. "Haven't seen anyone." His mind was working again, the old training surfacing through the rust. 3 men, 30 yards. The porch railing offered partial cover. The woodpile to his left was better. "Tell you what," Flynn Nash said, his voice dropping the pretense of friendliness. He knew his name. "Why don't we just take a quick look around, put everyone's mind at ease?" No. The single word was a line drawn in the dust. Nash's smile finally vanished, replaced by a look of cold annoyance. "Now, friend, that's not very neighborly." "My land, my rules," Cassidy said, shifting his weight, bringing the rifle into a more ready position. "Unless you've got papers from a judge you can ride on." Nash exchanged a silent, knowing look with his men. When he turned back, his hand was gripping his pistol. "Here's the thing about this particular girl, Flynn," he said, his voice dropping to an almost intimate whisper. "She's the daughter of Chief Iron Bear, and men who interfere with business transactions of that magnitude, well, they tend to have accidents. We know all about Fort Defiance, Captain. We know you have a habit of being in the wrong place when things go sideways." The mention of his old rank of that cursed place was a deliberate, poisoned dart. It was meant to unbalance him, to trigger the old guilt. Through the cabin's thin walls, Cassidy heard the faint creak of the rear window being eased open. Good girl. She was smart. But Nash heard it too, his head cocked slightly like a hunting dog catching a scent. "Sounds like you might have mice," Nash said, and his pistol cleared its holster with a motion so fluid it was almost invisible. The world exploded. The standoff lasted 3 heartbeats before hell broke loose. Cassidy's rifle came up as Nash's pistol fired. The bullet tore through the porch post where his head had been a second before. Simultaneously, the sound of breaking glass from the cabin's rear window punctuated the shot. He dove behind his water trough as more bullets splintered the wood around him, catching a fleeting glimpse of Ayanna sprinting for the tree line, her torn dress snagging on the underbrush, but not stopping her. One of Nash's men wheeled his horse, intending to ride her down. Cassidy's next shot was instinctive, a perfect lead. The bullet didn't hit the rider, but the horse. The animal screamed and reared, dumping its rider hard onto the ground. "Bring her back alive," Nash bellowed, taking cover behind his own mount. "She's no good to us dead." The fallen rider, limping heavily, gave chase on foot, while the third man circled wide, trying to flank Cassidy's position. The fight was on. The rust fell away, and Captain Flynn of the 7th Cavalry was back, however, briefly. He rolled left, came up firing, and forced the flanking rider to retreat behind the woodshed. But Nash was a professional. He used his horse as mobile cover, advancing steadily on the porch. The man was a tactician, not just a thug. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Flynn Nash called out over the gunfire. "A man like you always drawn to lost causes." The words were a physical blow, a reminder of every failure. That moment of distraction nearly cost him his life. Nash's next shot punched through the water trough, sending a spray of water and wooden splinters flying past his face. He felt a sharp sting on his cheek. From the woods he heard the sound of breaking branches and a man's angry curse. Ayanna was putting up a fight, but she was injured. She wouldn't last long. He had to end this now. He feinted left, drawing fire from both remaining men, then rolled right and came up running, closing the distance to the flanking rider at the woodshed. The man was focused on the water trough, expecting Cassidy to still be there. He never saw him coming. The solid stock of the Winchester connected with his temple, and he dropped like a sack of grain. 2 down. Nash, now alone, saw the tide turn. He backed toward his horse, his pistol still trained on Cassidy. "This isn't over, Flynn. That girl is worth more than you know." He swung up onto his horse, still covering Cassidy. "You can't protect her forever. We'll be back, and next time we won't be so polite." As Nash spurred his horse toward the woods to retrieve his dazed man, Cassidy knew this was far from over. He hadn't just helped an injured girl, he'd stumbled into a conspiracy that was somehow tied to his own damned past. The sound of horses moving through the trees told him Nash had found his man, but there was no sign of Ayanna. Had they caught her? He plunged into the woods, his heart hammering against his ribs, not from the exertion, but from a cold, familiar fear, the fear of being too late to save someone who mattered. He found her 20 yards and crouched behind a fallen log, blood seeping from where the gash on her forehead had reopened. She was breathing hard, but her eyes were alert and fierce. A thick, sturdy branch was gripped in her hands like a war club. At her feet lay the unconscious form of Nash's man, a matching gash across his own forehead. "Did I kill him?" she asked, her voice steady. For the first time, she spoke to him in English. Cassidy knelt beside the groaning man and felt for a pulse. "No. But you gave him something to remember you by." He looked at her with a newfound respect. Chief Iron Bear's daughter knows how to handle herself. Her eyes flashed a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "How do you know my father?" Nash let it slip, Cassidy said, helping her to her feet. He saw her wince as she put weight on her left ankle. "Are you hurt?" "I can walk," she said, testing it gingerly, "but not far and not fast." The sound of horses moving back through the woods told them Nash was regrouping. He would be back and with more men. Cassidy made a decision. "My cabin's compromised. There's an old line shack about 2 miles north of here. We can hold up there until dark, figure out our next move." As they moved through the trees, a silent, grim procession, Ayanna finally broke the silence. Why did he mention Fort Defiance? What happened there? Cassidy's jaw tightened. Nothing that matters now. "It matters if it's why men like him are hunting me." She insisted, stopping and forcing him to face her. "Men like Nash don't know about military posts unless they have connections." "What kind of soldier were you, Cassidy Flynn?" The question hung between them, sharp as a blade. He looked into her determined eyes and knew she deserved the truth, especially if knowing it might keep her alive. "The kind that made mistakes," he said, his voice raw. 3 years ago, I was a captain at Fort Defiance. There was an incident. An Apache peace delegation came to negotiate a treaty. Some of the officers there didn't want peace. They wanted an excuse for war." Understanding cold and stark dawned in her expression. "You were there when they murdered the peace chiefs." "I was there when everything went wrong," he corrected, resuming his pace, needing the movement to outrun the memories. "Your people came to talk. My commanding officer, Colonel Morrison, had other plans. When the shooting started, I had to choose a side." He paused at the edge of a small clearing, his eyes scanning for any sign of pursuit. "I chose the one that got me court-martialed and exiled to this ridge." Ayanna studied him with new eyes. "You tried to protect the delegation." "I tried," he said, the words heavy with 3 years of guilt. "It wasn't enough. 5 good men died because I hesitated when I should have acted decisively. Both sides lost men who shouldn't have." They reached the line shack just as the sun began its slow descent, painting the western peaks in hues of orange and blood. The small structure was weathered but solid, offering a clear view of the surrounding terrain. As they settled inside the cramped, dusty space, Ayanna pulled a small oilskin pouch from inside her dress. "This is why they want me," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside were several folded pieces of paper covered in neat, official-looking handwriting. They were letters. Military correspondence. Cassidy took them, his blood turning to ice as he read. They were copies of orders, plans for unprovoked attacks on Apache settlements disguised as retaliatory raids, lists of names men taking bribes from railroad and mining interests to instigate a full-blown war. The territory would be cleared, and they would get rich from the ensuing military contracts. He recognized several signatures. Colonel Morrison, the man who had orchestrated his dismissal. Captain Willis, who had led the charge against the peace delegation. "Your brother, he found this conspiracy?" Cassidy asked, his voice hollow. Ayanna nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "My brother Running Wolf worked as a scout for the army. He found these in Captain Willis's quarters. He trusted me with them." Her voice hardened into a cold, flat tone. 3 days later, they found his body by the river. They said he fell from his horse, drowned. But you know better. Running Wolf could swim before he could walk, and horses don't throw riders hard enough to crack their skulls. She touched the silver necklace at her throat. This was his. It's all they left me. The necklace. It pulled another memory from the depths. I think I saw him die, Cassidy said, his voice cracking. Ayanna went very still. What? 3 years ago, at Fort Defiance, there was a young Apache scout who tried to warn the delegation about the ambush. He was wearing a necklace just like that one. He tried to reach Chief Stone Crow to shield him. He took 3 bullets for his trouble. That wasn't Running Wolf, Ayanna whispered, her face pale. That was our cousin Brave Eagle. My brother died 6 months ago. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. This wasn't a new conspiracy. It had been running for years, a systematic elimination of anyone who got too close to the truth. First, Brave Eagle at Fort Defiance, then Running Wolf when he found the letters. And now, they were after Ayanna. He looked down at a worn photograph he kept on the shack's rough mantelpiece, the only possession he truly valued. It was him and Sarah, taken a week before the Fort Defiance incident. She was smiling, radiant. And around her neck was the silver locket with the falcon and the turquoise stars. Ayanna's gaze followed his. She drew a sharp breath. That locket. It was my wife's, Cassidy said, his voice thick. I have seen one like it, Ayanna said slowly. Brave Eagle, my cousin. He spoke of it. He said a soldier's wife at the fort was holding a similar piece for a young trooper, a friend of his. A family heirloom. The world tilted on its axis. The bank robbery in Redemption. Nash stealing that specific locket. The name of the young soldier who had died beside him at Fort Defiance, a good kid who had also tried to stop the massacre. His friend, Thomas Nash. Gideon Nash, Thomas Nash. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a reckoning. Gideon Nash wasn't just a mercenary working for the conspirators. He was the brother of the man Cassidy had failed to save. The locket hadn't just been Sarah's. It had belonged to the Nash family. Gideon hadn't just been robbing a bank. He had been reclaiming the last piece of his brother, and in doing so had found the man he blamed for it all. The sound of approaching horses cut through the evening air, far more numerous this time. Cassidy moved to the window. At least 6 riders were picking their way up the mountain trail. Nash had kept his word. We need to move. Cassidy said, his mind racing, the personal and the political now fused into one deadly crisis. Is there somewhere safe you can take these? Someone who will believe you. Agent Thompson at the territorial office in Santa Fe, Ayanna said, struggling to her feet. He knew my brother, trusted him. But that's a 3-day ride, and I can... A rifle cracked from the tree line, and the window above Cassidy's head exploded in a shower of glass. Cassidy Flynn! A voice boomed across the clearing. It was one of the other men, not Nash. Send out the girl, and we'll let you walk away from this. Ayanna touched his arm, her eyes pleading. You don't have to do this. Give me the letters. Let me go. They want me, not you. Cassidy looked at her, at this brave young woman who carried the weight of a coming war in a small leather pouch. He saw his wife's ghost in her defiance, saw Thomas Nash's courage in her resolve. 3 years ago, he had hesitated. He had weighed the odds, considered the consequences, and chosen wrong. He turned from the window, his face set like granite. He checked the action on his Winchester. No, he said, his voice calm and clear. This time I don't hesitate. The line shack erupted in a storm of lead and splintered wood. Nash's men opened up from 3 sides, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm and destroy. Cassidy shoved Ayanna behind a heavy, overturned oak table that offered some meager cover. He returned fire through the shattered window, his shots measured and deliberate. Pick a target. Conserve ammunition. Make every shot count. The old mantras of combat discipline were a steadying rhythm in the chaos. "There's a root cellar behind the stove," Cassidy shouted over the deafening roar of gunfire. "Can you make it?" Ayanna nodded, clutching the oilskin pouch to her chest. She began to crawl toward the back of the shack as Cassidy laid down a curtain of suppressing fire, forcing the attackers to keep their heads down. But Nash was too smart for a simple frontal assault. While his men pinned Cassidy in place, Nash himself was circling around to the unguarded rear of the building. Cassidy caught a flicker of movement through a crack in the back wall, just as the rear door splintered inwards, kicked off its hinges. "Drop the rifle, Flynn," Nash commanded. Cassidy spun around. Nash stood in the doorway, his pistol trained not on Cassidy, but on Ayanna, who was frozen halfway to the cellar entrance. "One wrong move," Nash said with chilling calm, "and she's dead before she hits the floor." The shooting outside stopped abruptly. Nash's men were moving in, surrounding the shack. They were trapped. "Smart choice," Nash said, stepping fully inside. "Now kick the rifle over here." Cassidy complied, sliding the Winchester across the rough floorboards. His mind raced, searching for an opening, a mistake, any chance at all. The letters Nash demanded, his eyes fixed on Ayanna. "Where are they?" "What letters?" Ayanna said, her voice betraying no fear. Nash crossed the room in 2 strides and backhanded her across the face. She stumbled, a trickle of blood appearing at the corner of her lip, but her eyes blazed with defiance. "Don't play games with me, girl. Your brother stole documents that belong to very important men. We want them back." Cassidy tensed every muscle, screaming to retaliate, but Nash's pistol swung toward him. "Easy, hero. You've caused enough trouble for one lifetime." The pistol swung back to Ayanna. "The letters are hidden." She lied, her voice ringing with conviction. "Where you'll never find them, even if you kill us both." "Oh, we're not going to kill you," Nash said, that cold, predatory smile returning. "You're far too valuable alive." "But your friend here?" He shrugged, a gesture of casual indifference. "He's expendable." The pistol swung back toward Cassidy. Time seemed to warp, stretching out into an eternity. In that crystalline moment, Cassidy saw it all laid bare. He could surrender and pray for a miracle, or he could act. He could trade his life for the seconds she needed. At Fort Defiance, he had chosen caution, and the world had burned. He would not make that mistake again. He lunged. He moved an instant before Nash pulled the trigger. The bullet meant for his heart tore through the fleshy part of his shoulder, spinning him around, but not stopping his forward momentum. He crashed into Nash, his weight carrying them both to the floor in a desperate, violent tangle of limbs. Nash was strong, fueled by years of simmering hatred. But Cassidy was powered by a final, desperate need for redemption. They rolled across the floor, grappling for control of the pistol. Cassidy managed to pin Nash's gun hand to the floorboards, but Nash drove his knee hard into Cassidy's wounded shoulder. White-hot agony exploded through his body, and his vision swam. Through the haze of pain, he heard the sound he'd been praying for, the heavy creak of the cellar door being pulled shut. Ayanna was safe. Nash heard it too. A snarl of pure rage contorted his face. He twisted with surprising strength, bringing the pistol around, pointing it toward the spot where Ayanna had vanished. "No," Cassidy roared, throwing the last of his strength into one final act. He shoved himself across Nash's body directly into the path of the gun. The second shot was a hammer blow to his chest. The world went gray at the edges. The sounds of the shack faded into a dull roar. But he held on his dying weight a final anchor, pinning the man who was his nemesis, his accuser, and the brother of his fallen friend. As darkness threatened to claim him, he heard a new sound cutting through the ringing in his ears, the thunder of distant hoofbeats growing closer. Help was coming. Or perhaps it was simply death riding a fast horse. The hoofbeats belonged to Apache warriors. A war party moving with silent, deadly purpose materialized from the twilight. At their head was a man whose face seemed carved from the granite of the mountains themselves, Chief Iron Bear. He surveyed the scene inside the shack, the dead and wounded mercenaries outside the splintered walls, the two men locked in a grim embrace on the floor, and his expression was unreadable. Nash scrambled backward, his pistol forgotten, his face a mask of disbelief and sudden terror. The tables had not just turned. They had been obliterated. Father Ayana emerged from the cellar, the precious oilskin pouch clutched in her hand. Her face was bruised and bloodied, but she was alive, her spirit unbroken. A flicker of profound relief crossed the chief's stoic features. "You are hurt, daughter." "I will live," she said, her gaze immediately going to Cassidy, who was trying to press a hand to the gushing wound in his chest. "But this man, he saved my life. Without him, Nash would have killed me and destroyed the evidence." Chief Iron Bear's dark, penetrating eyes settled on Nash, who was now backed against the far wall like a cornered wolf. "You are the one who took my daughter." "Now hold on," Nash stammered. His charisma vanished, replaced by a desperate, wheedling tone. "This is all a misunderstanding. We were merely hired to retrieve stolen property." Silence. The chief's voice was not loud, but it carried the absolute authority of a man who led a nation. It cut through Nash's protests like a blade. "My scouts have been tracking you for 2 days. We know what you are." Outside, the sounds of brief struggle followed by surrender confirmed it. Nash's men were being efficiently disarmed by the warriors. The cavalry Nash had counted on had become his undoing. The letters Father Ayana said, holding up the pouch. "Running Wolf died to get these. They prove everything. The army is planning to massacre our people for profit." Chief Iron Bear took the documents. His expression grew darker with each page he scanned in the failing light. "Colonel Morrison," he said the name, a low growl. "I know this name. He offered to sell my people rifles last winter. He said he wanted to help us defend ourselves." The bitter irony was lost on no one. He planned to arm them, then use those same weapons as proof of their aggression to justify a war. Cassidy, struggling to breathe, pushed himself into a sitting position against the wall. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. "Agent Thompson." In Santa Fe, he rasped. "He'll listen. He can stop this." "You know this agent?" the chief asked, his gaze sharp. "Served with his brother. At Fort Defiance," Cassidy managed. "Good man. He'll want to see those letters." "Nash, he works for the conspiracy. He knows the names, the contacts. Make him talk." Nash's face, already pale, turned ashen. "You can't let them take me," he pleaded, looking wildly between the chief and Cassidy. "I'm a white man. There are laws. The same laws that were going to let you profit from the murder of my people." Ayana's voice was ice. "The same laws that called the murder of my brother an accident." Chief Iron Bear's gaze returned to Cassidy. A long measured assessment from a man who had spent a lifetime judging the hearts of others. "Why did you help my daughter? You could have turned her over to these men. You could have saved yourself." Cassidy met the chief's unwavering eyes, drawing on a reserve of strength he didn't know he possessed. 3 years ago, I failed to protect your people when it mattered most. Good men died because I hesitated. He looked at Ayanna, at the strength and courage that burned in her. I wasn't going to fail again. Going. A silent understanding passed between the two men, an acknowledgement of shared loss and a common enemy. My daughter says you took bullets that were meant for her, the chief stated. Anyone would have done the same. No, Chief Iron Bear said quietly, his voice resonating with ancient wisdom. They would not. Most men think only of saving themselves. He turned to two of his warriors. Bind this one, he ordered, pointing a finger at Nash. We will take him to Santa Fe. Let the white man's courts hear his testimony. He glanced back at Cassidy, then at his daughter, and let them hear ours. 6 weeks later, Cassidy Flynn sat on the porch of his rebuilt cabin. The morning sun was warm on his face, painting the mountains in hues of gold and amber. His chest still ached with a dull, persistent throb where Nash's bullets had torn through him. But the Apache medicine woman, a tiny, wizened woman with hands as gentle as milkweed fluff, had worked miracles. The scars, physical and otherwise, would remain. But he was alive. The conspiracy had unraveled with astonishing speed. Armed with the letters and the coerced, detailed testimony of Gideon Nash, Agent Thompson had moved decisively. Colonel Morrison was in a military prison, awaiting a court-martial that would surely end with a hangman's noose. Captain Willis had been captured near the California border. A dozen other officers and officials had been implicated, their careers and reputations destroyed. The war for profit would never happen. Gideon Nash, in exchange for his cooperation, was facing a long, quiet life in a federal penitentiary. A fate perhaps worse than death for a man of his ambition. A sound from the valley below drew Cassidy's attention. A lone rider was making her way up the path. Ayanna! She approached on a fine-limbed paint horse, moving with the fluid, easy grace of someone born to the saddle. She had visited regularly during his recovery, bringing poultices from the medicine woman and news from Santa Fe. Her presence, a quiet, steadying force. You're looking stronger, she said, dismounting and tying her horse to the porch rail. Feel stronger, he replied. Your father's medicine woman is a miracle worker. She says you heal quickly for a stubborn white man. Ayanna said, the corners of her lips twitching in a rare small smile. Her words, not mine. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, watching a hawk circle on the updrafts over the valley. The world felt peaceful, a state so foreign to Cassidy that it was almost unsettling. Agent Thompson asked me to offer you a position, Ayanna said, finally breaking the silence. As a territorial scout. He says men who understand both sides of the conflict are rare. Men he can trust are even rarer. Cassidy considered the offer. 3 years ago, he had fled to this ridge to escape the world. He had built walls of solitude around his heart. But isolation hadn't brought him peace. It had only been a holding pattern, a long, empty wait. Only action, the choice to help Ayanna, had begun to quiet the ghosts. What do you think I should do? He asked, his gaze meeting hers. Ayanna chose her words with care. I think that good men should not hide from their purpose. My father says you have the heart of a warrior, even if you doubt it yourself. And what does his daughter say? She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers toying with the silver necklace her brother had worn. His daughter says that sometimes an accident can change everything for the better. He looked at her, at this remarkable woman who had endured so much, who had fought kidnappers, exposed corruption, and saved her people. And he knew she was right. The accident of finding her bleeding by his creek had not been the end of his quiet life. It had been the beginning of a real one. I never did kidnap you, technically, he said, a dry smile touching his own lips. No, she agreed, but you did save me. which turned out to be the same thing in the end. She stood preparing to leave, then paused. Agent Thompson is expecting an answer by next week. A thoughtful expression crossed her face. If you take the job, you'll likely be spending a lot of time near the territorial office in Santa Fe. I am working with him now as an envoy for my father, helping to establish better communication between the tribes and the government. She swung up onto her horse with practiced ease, her back straight and proud. Someone needs to make sure that what happened at Fort Defiance never happens again. As she rode away, a silhouette of grace and strength against the vast open sky, Cassidy understood that his choice was already made. The broken man who had hidden on this ridge for 3 years was gone. He had been replaced by someone who had finally learned the difference between running from the past and building a future from its ruins. First, though, there was one last journey he had to make. A week later, he stood amidst the crumbling ghost-haunted ruins of Fort Defiance. He found the small, unmarked plot of earth outside the old cemetery walls where the camp followers had been buried. He knelt and cleared away the weeds, his hands gentle. From his pocket he took the silver locket with the falcon emblem returned to him by Chief Iron Bear. He held it in his palm, the metal warm from the sun. "Sarah," he whispered to the wind, "I'm sorry." I hesitated, but I'm not hesitating anymore. He placed the locket on the small pile of stones that served as a grave marker. It was an offering, a release, a final goodbye, not just to her, but to the guilt that had been his constant companion for so long. He stood, and for the first time in 3 years, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. He turned his back on the ruins and walked toward the future. Months later, Ayanna found him in redemption. He wasn't hiding. He was working at the livery, the simple, honest labor a balm for his soul. She rode into town not as a chief's daughter, but as a diplomat, her bearing confident and purposeful. She dismounted and walked toward him, a proposal in her eyes that had nothing to do with Agent Thompson. "The territorial government needs a liaison," she said, her voice clear and direct. "Someone the tribes will trust. Someone I trust." She wasn't relaying an offer from someone else. She was making her own. "I need a partner, Cassidy, to help me build the bridge." He looked at this incredible woman, at the shared path that had been forged in violence and loss, and saw not a job, but a purpose. His redemption wasn't a reward to be given. It was a life to be lived, a trust to be earned day by day. He had a letter to write to Agent Thompson, but his answer was already in his eyes. "All right," he said. Together they stood and looked out past the dusty street toward the vast, open horizon, a future of shared work waiting for them both.